Hey everyone, it's William. Thanks for joining me for my second program on my new channel, Beyond Belief. Thanks for joining me. I pray everyone's having a great day today. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. When I was opening the last program, I was a little bit excited, and I started calling my other program by the name of this program. My other program is Beyond the Ties That Bind. Now, the sole focus of that program is the cause of freedom. I've covered things concerning the United States government, concerning the war between the states, concerning the Constitution on that channel, and I covered a lot of things that had to do with current events over the course of the last 2 years and how governments were trying to stifle the personal freedoms of individuals. Now, this program will be solely focused on Scripture. The most important thing in my life is my relationship with Eloheinu. So I believe that when I sit down to do something like this, it should be centered around the word of Eloheinu, around Scripture, around Him. Now, last program, we started a series on prophecy, on Matthew 24. Now, anytime you mention the word prophecy, the book of Revelation is probably the first book that pops up in people's minds. Now, that being stated, whatever interpretation of the book of Revelation that you may have today, the message must have made sense to the original audience of Yochanan's day. It would be cruel to give them words which were not applicable to them. Words meant for thousands of years later after their persecutions were over. Now, Revelation is a real letter addressed to real people who lived real lives and struggled to remain steadfast in their obedience to Yisrael's Eloheinu. And they were struggling to do this in a dark and pagan world. The message of Revelation speaks to the core of their persecutions, and we must understand it in this light first and foremost. So a lot of people over the course of the last few years, course of the last couple years, especially with the introduction of the jab, you have people stating that, oh man, this is the mark of the beast, and nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, it's a mark. It's a mark of a beast, the pharmaceutical beast. And no one should take this. No one should take anything. No one should do anything or bow to anything where someone says, if you don't do this, you're not going to be able to do this, this, and this. Just based upon the principle of freedom alone. However, in Scripture, we had situations with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. We had situations with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Nebuchadnezzar. We had, a situation where Daniel was not supposed to make petition, or no one in the kingdom was supposed to make petition to anyone save the king for 30 days. Daniel prayed to Eloheinu. He was taken, thrown in the lion's den. So there are a lot of different marks of beast all throughout our history. And a lot of people get so tied up in this because they allow the newspaper to form their view of Scripture. They allow newspaper headlines to dictate how they believe Scripture should be interpreted. And that is wrong. Scripture will interpret Scripture, and history of that time will interpret what Scripture is talking about in prophecy. Also, we must realize audience. We have to step back and say, okay, this is being spoken to a specific audience, and it's not me. Americans like to put themselves in that first row. The Christian church likes to put itself in the first row. And a lot of people who have come out or say they've come out of the church hang on to that. Now, I was brainwashed to believe the doctrine of futurism. Then I graduated to historicism, which is nothing more than futurism 2.0. However, nothing was making sense. If you really stop and think about it, nothing was making sense, and you cannot make the puzzle pieces fit together. They don't. However, when you look at the view, which I'm going to be speaking of, things fit. Why? Because audience matters. Because you're stopping to comprehend the text. And as I stated, I bought into this. I had preconceived notions about what I was reading. So I'd already drawn the conclusion in my mind that I wanted to come to. And a lot of people are listening to this right now, already drawing a conclusion. I'm telling you, step out of your element. Step out of your comfort zone. Get out of the the church box you're in, and start thinking and allowing Scripture to think, allow Scripture to explain itself, to interpret itself. Because a lot of people, and I was this way, I had already drawn the conclusion when I started to study prophecy. And a lot of people are that way with every doctrine that they believe. When they're studying something, they're not studying something to find the truth. They're studying something to entrench themselves further in the doctrine that they already believe. And that's not how we approach Scripture. So anyway, when you talk about prophecy, Matthew 24 is a chapter that people think of. And as I stated, people are turning this book into a work of fiction because they're allowing newspaper headlines to dictate how they interpret Scripture, and then they're talking about this to other people. And then when these things don't come to pass, they look foolish. And not only do they look foolish, but then other people who they've tried to pawn off their ideas on, then look at them and look at Scripture like it's a work of fiction, like people who believe this don't know what they're talking about, and then therefore maybe the book itself, maybe the volume itself isn't true. Maybe it's fiction. Because every few years we hear that something else is going to happen, that this is the, beginning of tribulation. You hear it all the time. Oh man, this is the beginning of tribulation. Or, this is the mark of the beast. Oh my goodness. This is the end times. And not slowing down to look at the timestamps within Scripture, to look at how the phrase end times is used within Scripture, not looking at the audience. So therefore, their confusion is sown. And like stated, there's a lot of people, I don't want to hear this, I'm uncomfortable. Well, it's time to get uncomfortable. It's time to leave behind that church doctrine of futurism. It's time to leave behind that false doctrine. Now, not everybody's going to get it, and don't try and get it all at once. I was talking to a person one time, and I could tell that she's trying to process it all at once. She wants to grab it all and understand it all at once. I had a friend, he was a leader of a synagogue up in St. Louis. And he always told me, concentrate on the meal that you're eating right now before you start worrying about what's on tomorrow's menu. And, a lot of good sayings like that. So I like to use that. Okay. A lot of people will say when we're talking about this, things will make sense, such as what I covered last time about this generation. We looked at all the times that Yeshua stated this generation throughout different verses within the Besorah accounts. And then we went to Matthew chapter 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, and we looked at this generation there and how people now want to make the term in those chapters be in reference to some future generation, when every other time within the Besorah accounts that Messiah used the term this generation, it had to do with the generation he was speaking of. So, confusion is created there. So anyway, just, that made sense to people. And think about that before you start thinking about something else. Let that sink in. Digest that. And then it'll be easier to move on to other subjects involving prophecy and other passages, other prophetic passages. So, think about what you're, listening to now and what we covered in the last one before you start saying, well, what about this in the book of Daniel? What about this in the book of Revelation? Because lots of times what we cover as we go through Matthew chapter 24 will answer the concerns which are found, which people may have concerning Daniel. Yeshayahu, the book of Isaiah, Yirmiyahu, the book of Jeremiah, our Revelation, are things that Shaul wrote concerning prophecy, which he does have prophetic text within his letters. And who are his letters to? They're not people 2,000 years removed from when he was writing these letters. They're to the people he was writing then and there at that time. So anyway, we're gonna get into this, and we're gonna continue to go through Matthew 24. I just ask people, think about, what's being covered now. Digest that before you move on and before you start thinking about other passages, because lots of times your questions will be answered. So anyway, I'm excited to be going through this, and we are going to go into part 2 here of comprehending the text. And we're going to be talking about persecutions that they went through, tribulation. Okay, so in Matthew chapter 24, verse 21 and 22, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days should be shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." The most tragic time in the history of the Malkut, or kingdom of Israel, was in 67 through 70 CE, during the siege and destruction of the city of Yehrushalayim by the Roman armies. Yeshua said it would be a time of great tribulation such as never had been before, nor ever would be again. This was the reason that Yeshua had warned his disciples, his Talmudim, to get out of the city and to head for the mountains just as soon as possible when they saw the armies surrounding the city. This was the abomination of desolation as discussed in part 1 of the program, and it was the sign for the disciples to flee. Note that Yeshua said, "Then shall be great tribulation," not many hundreds or thousands of years or more in the future. The great tribulation talked about in Matthew 24:21 took place during the days of the siege of Yerusalem in 67 and 70 CE, or through 70 CE, and was a tribulation on the Yehudim people, our Jewish people. I don't like using the word Jewish, so I'll be using the word Yehudim. So it was a tribulation on the Yehudim people and not on the believers in Messiah. It is pointless to separate this tribulation mentioned here from its contemporary setting and move it out of a place to a time either just before or just after a future coming of Messiah, as many like to do. This great tribulation is an actual historical fact, and we need not try to make it anything else out of it. Let me read that again. This great tribulation is an actual historical fact, and we need not try to make anything else out of it. The great tribulation is not a period of time in our future. It already happened years ago. I'm having a little bit of a hard time seeing the screen because of the glare coming in from the sun, but I don't want to close the curtain because then it'll be a little bit too dark in here. Okay, moving on. "For then shall be great tribulation." The word "for" gives the reason for the flight of the disciples. This was a local matter with them in Yerusalayim and Yehuda, and not something that applies to people in the future, okay? In Luke 21, 22, and 23, Yeshua said concerning that awful time of tribulation, "For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people." This would be the time when Eloheinu's wrath was finally poured out on Israel, as was said also by Shaul in 1 Thessalonians 2:16. "For the wrath is come upon them to the uttermost." Who's he talking about? The Yehudim. And he's saying wrath has come upon them to the uttermost. That day would be just around the corner after the believers got out of the city and left Yehuda for the mountains and safety elsewhere. The wrath was to be upon this people, that is, Yisrael, not the believers in Messiah. The believers had and would have their tribulation from both the Yehudim and the Romans, but the tribulation that would fall upon Yehrushalayim and Yehuda would be the wrath of Eloheinu. Eloheinu would recompense tribulation to them that trouble you. That's found in 2 Thessalonians 1 and 6. Eloheinu preserved his people from the days of great tribulation which came upon the land of Israel and on Yehrushalayim in particular in 67 through 70 CE. By following Yeshua's instructions to get out of the city and country when they saw the army surrounding the city of Yerusalem, they thereby secured for themselves safety and security during that awful time of tribulation. When they were taking Yeshua away to be hung on the stake, Yeshua told the daughters of Yehrushalayim not to weep for him, but for themselves and their children. Yeshua said, "Daughters of Yehrushalayim, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, Baruch are the barren, or blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. Then they shall begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us." Luke 23:28 through 30. This cannot refer to a final day of judgment in our future, nor to some future tribulation period after a fabled rapture, but to that great day of his wrath against Yehrushalayim and Yehuda. It was directed to them and to their children. This expression of crying for the mountains and hills to fall on them is used concerning man's reaction and response to the wrath of Eloheinu, as for example in Hosea 10:8, when Eloheinu was predicting his judgment upon Israel, it was predicted there that they shall say to the mountains, Cover us, and to the hills, Fall on us. These cries from the lost came from Yisrael, not Gentile nations, which is supposed within futurist doctrine. It should be noted that Luke flatly states that these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Let's read that again, especially that last part. It should be noted that Luke flatly states, and this is Yeshua speaking, that these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. What things which are written? All things which are written may be fulfilled. All things which were spoken of in the Torah and the prophets were going to be fulfilled when? During the days of vengeance. These be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Knowing that these events described by Luke apply to Yerushalayim's tragic destruction in 70 CE, we can safely conclude that it was those awesome events which marked the fulfillment of all the previous prophetic statements concerning the eventual judgment which was destined to befall Yisrael. History overwhelmingly corroborates the fulfillment of all the tragic events prophesied concerning the fall of Yerusalayim and the ensuing dispersion of the surviving remnant. The numerous prophecies spoken by Moshe, Daniel, Yirmiyahu, and even Messiah found their fulfillment in 70 CE. This period of great tribulation is not an event which the entire world is yet waiting, but a past historic event of unparalleled, concentrated severity, specifically afflicting the kingdom of Israel in 70 CE. Now, if we allow scripture and historical fact to rule the day, we're all going to come to the same conclusion, especially if we stop, slow down, consider audience, and keep things within their proper context. When you don't do that, you're all over the place and you're like Hal Lindsey and you got to issue a new update and a new understanding of prophecy every few years, or that other heretic, Tim LaHaye, who's dead and gone now. The futuristic doctrine continually has to change with the times. They continually have to rewrite what they believe. They're a bunch of heretics. Keep in mind that the Great Tribulation was not the time when the Romans finally came into the city, By then, the tribulation was practically near the end. The Great Tribulation was the entire 3.5 years of suffering and hunger and famine and murder and desecration and death, which were all taking place in those last several years of the history of Yehrushalayim. Much of it, or even most of it, was brought upon themselves by what went on inside the city. Okay. So you had a 3.5 year period of time, which that 3.5 years is mentioned in Scripture, and it lines up perfectly with history of what was going on in Yehrushalayim from the year 66 CE through 70 CE. All perfectly lines up, and it's a 3.5 year period of time. But see, as I stated before, if, say, General Robert E. Lee wrote to people in his Confederate Army and stated something, when you see Atlanta surrounded by Sherman's armies, know that its desolation is nigh. Or when you see, he wouldn't even have to say Sherman. When you see Atlanta surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is nigh. Now, if you didn't know the history concerning the war between the states, and you didn't know that at that time Atlanta was completely burned to the ground by Sherman's army, completely wiped out, laid flat to the ground. If you didn't know that, you'd still be looking for it to happen in your future. If you didn't know that happened. And that's what's going on today. People don't know what took place in that 3.5 year period of time leading up to 70 CE. So when they read prophetic texts, they think automatically in the future, because they believe that all prophecy concerns something in the future. Prophetic text does not always address things in the future. Lots of times it's a warning for the present. It's a call back to the righteousness of Torah. Okay, going on. The famine inside the city was such that children pulled the very morsels that their fathers were eating out of their very mouths. And, what was still more to be pitied, so did the mothers do as to their infants. And when those that were most dear were perishing under their hands, they were not ashamed to take from them the very last drops that might preserve their lives. The seditious everywhere came upon them immediately, and snatched away from them what they had gotten from others. That's from Josephus, page 402. I mean, so this is a bad time. Imagine being with your family, and maybe there's just one slice of bread, and you've got 4 people in your family, and you're sitting there, eating this bread, and the next thing you know, your own mother snatches it out of your hand because she's afraid of dying. The dread of fear upon her so much. Families turning against each other. And if you don't believe that, if you think, oh, mothers would never do that, look around today. Look at the things that happen in American cities. Look at the attitude of liberals. That stuff is happening today already. I mean, in a much smaller, not as bad as what we see today, but it's that spirit is here today. Josephus said that neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was, from the beginning of the world. The Romans tortured those who ventured out of the city to escape the tortures of the zealots inside, because you had warring going on within inside Yehrushalayim. The inhabitants of the city were warring against each other. They were first whipped, the people who were escaping were first whipped and then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died, and were then crucified before the wall of the city. This miserable procedure made Titus greatly to pity them. While they caught every day 500 Yehudim, nay, some days they caught more, so the soldiers, out of the wrath and hatred they bore the Yehudim, nailed those they caught, one after one way, and another after another, to crosses by the way of jest, when their multitude was so great that room was wanting for crosses, and crosses wanting for bodies. Titus built a wall clear around the city so that none could escape, and then the famine began to consume the people by whole houses and families. Renan said, "From this time forth, hunger, rage, despair, and madness dwelt in Yehrushalayim. It was a cage of furious maniacs, a city resounding with howling and inhabited by cannibals, a very hell." Titus, for his part, was atrociously vindictive. Every day 500 unfortunates were crucified in sight of the city, which hateful refinements of cruelty are sufficient ground whereon to erect them. Yeshua had predicted, "For the days will come on you that your enemies will raise up a rampart to you and will surround you and will keep you in on every side, and they will tear you down and your children within you, and will not leave a stone on the stone, because you did not know the time of your visitation." Luke 19:43 and 44. Okay, right here you have Titus. He built a wall clear around the city so that none could escape. The famine begins to consume the people by whole houses and families. This comes from Josephus. Renan said, "From this time forth, hunger, rage, despair, and madness dwelt in Yehrushalayim. It was a cage of furious maniacs." Titus, for his part, was atrociously vindictive. Every day 500 unfortunates were crucified in the sight of the city, with hateful refinements of cruelty are sufficient ground whereon to erect them. So, Yeshua had predicted that days will come on you that your enemies will raise up a rampart to you, will build a wall around the city, and will surround you and will keep you in on every side so that none can escape. And they will tear you down and your children within you, and will not leave a stone on a stone, because you did not know the time of your visitation. A lot of people right now don't know that the time of visitation took place back then. They try and put all of these prophetic texts in the future when if they would just take a minute to look at history, they would see that these things have already been fulfilled. And there's nothing special about the UN-created city of Jerusalem today. It's a modern wicked city. It's full of abominations, full of, you've got transgenderism, you've got sodomy, left and right. It's just as terrible of a city as San Francisco. It is not, those people are not the people of Eloheinu. They're Khazars. They're Ashkenazis from Eastern Europe who basically adopted Judaism. They're not the descendants of Abraham, Yitzhak, or Yaakov. They're not the true people, the true Yisrael that came from, that are Hebrew people that came from the loins of Abraham. And the only way they could be is if they converted to a belief in Messiah and a trust in him. Now, then they would be. But converting to Judaism doesn't save anyone. And even if you go to the old city of Jerusalem that's there, or Yehrushalayim, it's built 20 feet above the city that was there at the time of Yeshua. And a lot of people want to say that all these prophetic texts have to do with that place over there. That's not the people of Eloheinu. The people of Eloheinu are the people who believe in Mashiach, the people who believe in Messiah. That's the people of Eloheinu. That's his chosen people. Slow down, comprehend the text, read the scriptures. The people who believe in Messiah, you and I who believe in Messiah, we're his chosen people. Not Khazars, not Ashkenazis, not people who walk in Judaism. When the dead inside the city could not be buried and the stench of their dead bodies could not be endured, they had them cast down from the walls into the valleys beneath. When others deserted the city, they swallowed up gold pieces for their later use. But the Arabians with the Syrians cut up those that came as supplicants and searched their bellies. Nor does it seem to me that any misery befell the Yehudim that was more terrible than this, since in one night's time about 2,000 of these deserters were thus dissected. So they're swallowing gold pieces, so when they get to where they're going, they'll have some money. However, the Arabians and the Syrians would catch them outside the city, gut them, and go in after the gold pieces. And people today think they're being persecuted because they can't go to Burger King because they don't have a health passport, or they can't go to a Cardinals game or a Dodgers game or a Yankees game because they don't have a health passport, or they can't go to a movie because they don't have a health passport. They think that that's some type of persecution. Try being gutted for your money. When Titus learned of this, he threatened the Arabian and Syrian soldiers with death and his own soldiers as well. But some still secretly carried on these tragic acts. As time went on, the miseries of the Yehudim grew worse, and finally the Romans made an assault on the Tower of Antonio. This assault was made on what we would call today 717 AD of the year 70, the same day that orders were given to demolish the tower. On that very day, which was the 17th day of Tammuz, the sacrifice called the daily sacrifice had failed and had not been offered to Eloheinu for want of men to offer it. Josephus, page 430. The daily sacrifice ceased on 717 of 70 CE because the hands were all needed for defense. The last and the bloodiest sacrifice at the altar of burnt offerings was the slaughter of thousands of Yehudim who had crowded around it. From the time that Vespasian declared war on Yehuda, spring of CE 67, until cessation of sacrifices in the Hekal temple on 717 of 70 CE, was approximately 3.5 years. During all of the war, the morning and the evening sacrifices in the Hekal, or the temple, had been offered daily up until this time. There we have Daniel's prophecies fulfilled. Also prophecies in Revelation fulfilled. In a sacred history of Sulpicius Severus, pages 363 through 420, a contemporary of Jerome and Augustine, a history of the world from creation to CE 400 is given. Of this dreadful tribulation period of the Yehudim in CE 70, he wrote, "The Yehudim, meanwhile, being closely besieged, as no chance either or peace of surrender was allowed them, were at length perishing from famine, and the streets began everywhere to be filled with dead bodies, for the duty of burying them could no longer be performed. Moreover, they ventured on eating all things of the most abominable nature, and did not even abstain from human bodies, except those which putrefaction had already laid hold of, and thus excluded from use as food. The Romans accordingly rushed in upon the exhausted defenders of the city, and it so happened that the whole multitude from the country and from other towns of Judea had then assembled for the day of Passover, doubtless because it pleased Eloheinu that the impious race should be given over to the destruction at the very time of year which they had crucified Yeshua. The Pharisees for a time maintained their ground most boldly in defense of the Hekal, the temple, and at length, with minds obstinately bent on death, they, of their own accord, committed themselves to the flames. The number of those who suffered death is related to have been 1,100,000, and 100,000 were taken captive and sold. One taken, one left. One woman who had lost everything but her baby to these bloodthirsty Yehudim then killed her baby son and then roasted him and ate the one half of him and kept the other half by her concealed. When the seditious men smelled the horrid scent of this food, they threatened her that they would cut her throat immediately if she did not show them what food she had gotten ready. She replied that she had saved a very fine portion of it for them, and withal uncovered what was left of her son. Hereupon they were seized with a horror and amazement of mind, and stood astonished at the sight. When she said to them, "This is my own son, and what hath been done was mine own doing. Come, eat of this food, for I have eaten of it myself." The men left, trembling and frightened. The whole city was overcome by distress when they heard of such things. From Josephus, page 443, 444. That is, and people think that they're being persecuted today, are going through anything near what people who were having the wrath of Eloheinu poured out upon them at that time were. It's because people don't know history. They don't look at history. Even the historicists don't look at history. They have no idea what happened here. And they don't know how to put two and two together to come up with the proper conclusion of 4. The text and history itself, they go together hand in hand. And even some of the things which were taking place in the book of Acts lets you see that the prophecies were being fulfilled at that time. Some of them are starting to be fulfilled. So this kind of thing was the sort of curse that Eloheinu had promised would come upon Yisrael, as he told them of the conditions that would bring chastisement in the land. So he tells them, he promises these things are going to come upon Israel. He says what's going to bring chastisement upon them. So if we look at Devarim, book of Deuteronomy 28, especially verse 53, "And you shall eat the fruit of your own body, and the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, which Yahweh, your Eloheinu, has given you, in the siege and in the anguish with which your enemies shall distress you." This is written by Moshe. It's in the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 28, verse 53. Everything we just read there from Josephus, which took place 2,000 years ago in the 1st century, 70 CE, it was prophesied by Moshe, Eloheinu is letting them know what's going to happen. He says, "You shall eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, which Yahweh, your Eloheinu, has given you, in the siege and in the anguish with which your enemies shall distress you." We don't slow down. We don't consider the history. And therefore, we have confusion. We have false doctrine. This was prophesied it would happen, and it took place. Yet people don't know it took place because they don't pay attention to the history surrounding the events of 70 CE. Titus finally gave the orders to set fire to the gates of the Hekal, the temple. He wanted to save the most Kodesh place, or the set-apart place, but furious soldiers who had no such orders to do so set fire to a window which opened to a passage leading to the rooms of the set-apart place, which greatly enraged the Yehudim. But so it was. The set-apart house, the house of Yahweh, burned up, even though Titus disapproved of what was done. So Titus gives an order that it should not be touched, and yet it's razed to the ground. Why? Because it was prophesied by Yeshua that he would do so with his coming, his presence. On the 9th day of the 8th month, 70 CE, Titus entered into the temple, or the Hekal. The next day was the same day 600 years before, when Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the first Hekal. So, Elohim promises that the conditions, he told them of the conditions which are going to bring chastisement, and he tells them of what's going to happen by their enemies and what they're going to be doing. We have it right there in the Word. Fulfilled prophecy. That's cute. I think I'll use it again. Grazel also said that when the soldiers marched in, the slaughter which then condemned is beyond description. While the Kodesh, or the set-apart house, was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. Nor was there any commiseration of any age, or any reverence of gravity, but children and old men and profane persons and priests were all slain in the same manner. And now the Romans, upon the flight of the seditious into the city, and upon the burning of the Kodesh house itself, and of all the building round about it, brought their ensigns to the Hekal, or the temple, and set them over against its eastern gate, and there did they offer sacrifices to them, and there did they make Titus imperator. Josephus 456 and 457. I told you I'd use it again. When the city was completely taken, the Roman soldiers slew those whom they overtook without mercy, and set fire to the houses whither the Yehudim were fled, and burnt every soul in them, and laid waste a great many of the rest. And when they were come to the houses to plunder them, they found in them entire families of dead men, and the upper rooms full of dead corpses, that is, of such as died by the famine. They then stood in horror at this sight. And went out without touching anything. So even these men were shaken about what had been going on within the city walls, while they had laid siege to the city and built a rampart around it, a wall around it. We need to realize the vast scope of this great tribulation upon the people of Israel. It was not just Yehrushalayim, but all over Palestine, that the whole country felt this awful catastrophe which happened to them. Relying on Josephus for his information and his speaking of the time when the beginning of the war blazed up in the 12th year of Nero's reign, Eusebius said that throughout Palestine the revolt of the Yehudim was followed by hopeless confusion, and that on every side the members of the nation were mercilessly destroyed as if they were enemies by the inhabitants of various cities. The cities could be seen full of unburied corpses, the dead bodies of the aged flung down alongside those of infants, women without a rag to conceal their nakedness, and the whole province full of indescribable horrors. Even worse than the atrocities continually committed were the threats of terror to come. And that comes from Eusebius, The History of the Church, page 105 and 106. Not only did destruction fall on the cities of Yehuda, but even in other countries the Yehudim found themselves under terrible tribulation. Josephus said there was not any Syrian city which did not slay their Yehudim inhabitants, and were more bitter enemies to us than were the Romans themselves. Yeshua had said, "For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people." Luke chapter 21:23. This great distress and wrath was the great tribulation of Matthew chapter 24, verse 21. It involved great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. Luke 21:23. It is doubtful if anything before or since has equaled it for ruthless slaughter and merciless destruction. From the locality of the assemblies in Asia Minor to the borders of Egypt, the land was a slaughterhouse. City after city was wrecked, sacked, and burned, till it was recorded that cities were left without an inhabitant. And you can go there today and you can see at that time where these cities were abandoned. And if we just look at history, we can see that, a lot of people try and make these guesses about what's going to take place in the future, and they're always wrong. Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, all these people who are futurists, always wrong. Always gotta, retract, and always then they issue some new prophecy or some new thought on what's going to happen, and they're always wrong. Always. And those of you who said that Great Tribulation has already started or getting ready to start, we'll be here 10 years from now, okay? You people don't know what you're talking about. Absolutely not. You're allowing newspaper headlines to determine how you view Scripture. Anyway, you go back then, and it was at that time that so many cities were destroyed. As he stated, from Asia Minor to the borders of Egypt. That's a long way. The Yehudim were being wiped out, and believers were being persecuted. For anyone to thoughtlessly say that this tribulation in 67 through 70 CE could not be as great as some supposed future tribulation on the Yehudim, such a person evidently has not read in detail the full account of those gruesome things that went on in Yehrushalayim during the tribulation of those days. It is one thing to be killed, but it is another thing to suffer as horribly as those people did. When one takes into account all the various kinds of suffering and torture that went on, one can easily believe that Yeshua meant exactly what he said when he said, "Never had there been a time like that, and never would be again." Now, a lot of people say, well, what about World War II? What about World War II? Those were not Yehudim. Those were not people who come from the loins of Abraham. The 1.5 million people who were killed were Ashkenazi, Khazar, people who adopted the belief of Judaism or the religion of Judaism. They were not true Yehudim, not true Yisrael. And the true Yisrael of Yahweh now are people who believe in Yeshua Messiah, people who trust in him, people who are obedient to him, people who obey him. He has become the author of eternal salvation unto those who obey him. The Ruach HaKodesh is given unto those who what? Obey him. Those are the people of Yahweh, not some people who have converted to Judaism from Eastern Europe and Western Asia. So anyway, so World War II, what happened in World War II doesn't even concern Yehudim people. Doesn't even concern the Yehudim that are spoken of in Scripture, because they're not Yehudim. They're just converts to Judaism, which is a false religion. And we're going to cover that. I'm going to cover that. That's one thing that I really want to cover after this series is over sometime in the future. I've got some other things to cover, such as one of the verses that come up this time of year, which Messianics completely destroy and misinterpret. But the one thing that I want to do, because a lot of Messianics, they're in love with Israel. Most of them have never even been there, but they're in love with Israel of today. They're in love with as they call them, the Jewish people or Yehudim people, because they think that they're the people of the book, and they're not the people of the book. They're Ashkenazis or Khazars, and they have nothing to do with the book. The book that they actually believe in is a mystic book called Kabbalah. These people are imposters, yet they pulled the wool over the eyes of most Messianics, whatever. Anyway, so that's one thing I want to cover is who true Israel really are. And we'll see from their own admission, the people there today in the land will admit in their own writings, will admit in their own encyclopedias that they are not descendants of Abraham, that they are Ashkenazis, which came from Eastern Europe. But they got the wool pulled over a lot of Zionist Christians' eyes, and they got the wool pulled over a lot of Messianics' eyes, and they got them believing their lies. So people need to open up their eyes and really look at things, and not just, people just run on emotion all the time. I see it all the time, especially in the Messianic movement. And then things get messy because you're operating on emotion. It's all emotion. Hardly anything that's really grounded in Scripture. It's all emotion. Most of what you believe in the Messianic movement, or the Hebrew Toots, is all based on emotion. All emotion. And I can prove it and will prove it. And a lot of you Zionist Christians out there, you John Hagiites, all of what you believe for the most part is based on emotion. All emotion. He's another lying fat idiot. And going around peddling prophetic porn just to get people, just to put something sensational out there to get people excited so they listen to him. And a lot of people do, because they won't consider history and compare it to Scripture. And Michael Rood, that guy, got a lot of people out there hoodwinked. And I could go on, but I'm going to show you in a coming episode who Israel really is, and who the people today who claim to be Israel really are. Because a lot of people are fooled, and they allow this to affect how they approach Scripture. We got to get emotionalism out of this. We got to get fear out of this. We got to step out of our comfort zone. And no matter what Scripture says, and we got to follow Scripture and believe Scripture says. We got to believe what Scripture says, no matter if it contradicts what we've been brainwashed to believe, or the preconceived idea that we already have. We have to be willing to allow Scripture to mold and shape us and change us. Not everybody's going to come into this knowing all truth. That's not how it works. Little by little by little. But you have to be able to accept the truth when it's being given to you, if you're going to make His Malkut, His kingdom, your home. And you got to be willing to live in that kingdom now. Because, not everybody's going to get it. Because it's not given to everyone to know the mysteries of the Malkut HaShamayim, kingdom of heaven. Not everybody's going to get it. And not everybody's going to get it right away. I didn't get some of this stuff right away. It's a growing process. So don't try and consume it all at once. Don't try and digest it all at once. Because what happens when you eat too much and you continue to eat and your body tries to digest it? You'll wind up vomiting. You don't want to do that. A little bit at a time. A morsel here, a morsel there. Think on it. Meditate upon it. Pray on it. Read the Scriptures again. Keep audience in perspective. So, moving on, now that I've had my rant. No other event in the whole world ever did or could ever equal in importance what happened to the Yehudim in 67 through 70 CE. Their Hekal, their temple, their nation, their cities, their worship, their rituals, their genealogies. Yeah, genealogies, and that's something we'll touch on. Their everything, and almost the entire people were gone with no promise of ever being in existence again. And the only Yehudim, the only Israel, really not Yehudim. But, technically Yehudim because Mashiach is from the tribe of Yehuda. But the Yehudim, Israel, gone. So the only Yehudim, the only Israel that there is today are those who are washed in the blood of Mashiach. Those who trust in Him, those who obey His word. Not somebody who's wearing a kippah, wearing, a prayer shawl and standing in front of a wall, a Roman fortress, going back and forth and saying vain, repetitious prayers. The result of all the devastation in this great tribulation that occurred to those people in 67 through 70 CE was similar to what had been said many years before in the time of Yeshayahu, Isaiah. Your Kodesh, our set-apart cities, are a wilderness, Zion is a wilderness. Yehrushalayim is a ruin. Our Kodesh house and our beauty, where our fathers praised you, has become a burning of fire, and all our pleasant things are laid waste. This is what Yeshayahu, Isaiah stated. He says what would happen. I mean, that's why it talks about Babylon the Great is fallen. That's Yehrushalayim. A lot of people try and say it's a Roman Catholic institution. How could it be the Roman Catholic institution? It doesn't line up with what Yeshua said in Matthew chapter 23, where he said that the blood of all the prophets, from Abel to Zechariah, son of Berechiah, who was slain at the altar, would that this generation, that their blood would be upon this generation. So all of this was foretold. And a lot of people say, oh my goodness, that's so anti-Semitic that you would say Yerushalaim is somehow Mystery Babylon, is the harlot. That's anti-Semitic. Well, you need to read another anti-Semitic book, and that is Yeshayahu, where he says, Yerushalaim, the steadfast city, has become an harlot. Moving on, getting into too many rants here. It was Eloheinu. It was as Eloheinu had said concerning them at another time. Yahweh shall bring a nation against you from afar and from the end of the earth, as the eagle flies. A nation. Isn't it funny how the eagle was on the ensign or emblem of Rome? So anyway, I'll start over. Yahweh shall bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as the eagle flies, a nation whose tongue you shall not understand, a nation fierce of face, who shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. Josephus told us about that. And he shall eat the fruit of your cattle and the fruit of your land, until you are destroyed. He shall not leave you grain, wine, or oil, the increase of your livestock, or flocks of your sheep, until he has destroyed you. And he shall besiege you in all your gates, until your high and fortified walls, in which you trusted, come down throughout all the land. And he shall besiege you in all your gates throughout all your land, which Yahweh your Eloheinu has given you. And you shall eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, which Yahweh your Eloheinu has given you, in the siege and in the anguish with which your enemies shall distress you. The man that is tender among you and very delicate, his eye shall be evil toward his brother and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the rest of his sons which he has left, so that he will not give to any of them the flesh of his sons whom he shall eat, because he has nothing left to him in the siege, and in the anguish with which your enemies shall distress you in all your gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, who would not have ventured to set the sole of her foot on the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward the young one who comes out from between her feet, and toward her sons whom she shall bear. For she shall eat them secretly for lack of all things, in the siege and anguish with which your enemies shall distress you in your gates, if you will not observe to do all the words of this Torah, which are written in this book, that you may fear this majestic and fearful name, Yahweh your Eloheinu. Devarim, Deuteronomy 28, 49, 58, exactly what Josephus tells us did happen. Yahweh tells us this would happen to them because they would not obey or observe to do all the words of this Torah. And I'm talking about the Torah of righteousness. I'm not talking about these peripheral things. You know, a lot of people I'm not talking about their sacrifice and burnt offering. They ignored the widow, the fatherless. They had no mercy toward the stranger. They did not give. They did not keep the Decalogue. That's what brought them down. Not trinkets of not holding on to trinkets of Judaism like a lot of people want to do. It was tribulation upon the Yehudim people in those days, as foretold by Yeshua Messiah, all of which took place in the 3.5 years from 0467 CE to 092670 CE, when Yehrushalayim went up in flames. The Great Tribulation and parousia of Messiah of Matthew 24:21 and 29 through 30 do not relate to our end time, but both those events related to the events at the destruction of Yehrushalayim in 70 CE at the end of their age, not ours. In the events of the Great Tribulation, which Yeshua Messiah predicted for the nation of Israel, would be the summed up fulfillment of all prophecies remaining to be fulfilled concerning the Yehudim people. I'll read that again. In the events of the Great Tribulation, which Yeshua Messiah predicted for the nation of Israel, would be the summed up fulfillment of all prophecies remaining to be fulfilled concerning the Yehudim people. In Luke 21:22, Yeshua says, "For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled." Notice that he said all, not some. Everything concerning the Yehudim people which had been prophesied and not yet been fulfilled would be fulfilled in those closing days of the history of their nation. So, thank you for staying with me for the last hour. We'll cut it there because I have lots more to cover. We have many more parts to go through. We're going to go almost verse by verse through Matthew chapter 24 until we get to the end. And you will see these events have already taken place. What Yeshua prophesied has already taken place. So, until next time, thanks for staying with me this long. Until next time, Shalom Ve Barakah, which means peace and blessings. This is William Moore for Beyond Belief.